Imagine, if you will, waking up tomorrow morning, walking outside, and realizing that the fundamental rules of human existence have just been, permanently rewritten.
Like a total paradigm shift.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like 90 to 99% of all jobs, the physical labor, the administrative tasks, the creative grunt work, all of it is just entirely automated.
Poof. Yeah, gone overnight.
Right. And the concept of a lifespan, that's been radically extended. You and everyone you know can, easily expect to push past 150 years with the vitality of a 30-year-old.
Which is wild to even think about.
It really is. And everywhere you look, there is just infinite material abundance. We're talking limitless energy, food, resources, and all of it is generated and, flawlessly managed by an artificial superintelligence.
Sounds like the ultimate utopia.
Yeah.
Okay.
It sounds like humanity finally crossed the finish line, beat the boss level, and won the game of civilization.
It does paint a picture of absolute paradise. I mean, the complete eradication of scarcity, the end of poverty, the death of the daily grind.
Sounds amazing.
Right. On paper, it's everything our species has been striving towards since we first figured out how to harness fire.
But, and here is the massive mind-bending catch that we are looking at today. We have a stack of incredibly dense, provocative legal documents, socio-technological frameworks, and evolutionary psychology papers in front of us.
A huge stack. It's some heavy reading.
Very heavy. And their core thesis is basically a bucket of ice water to the face. They argue that without a fundamental, radical upgrade to both human biology and our global legal systems, this exact utopian scenario of infinite abundance won't lead to paradise at all.
Not even close.
In fact, these sources warn that if we just drop our current human brains into this post-scarcity world, it will trigger an epoch they terrifyingly refer to as the global slaughterhouse.
Yeah, that term definitely grabs your attention, and that is exactly the mission for this deep dive.
Let's get into it.
We are unpacking an impending, pretty much irreversible period that these frameworks call the Age of Transition. We're going to synthesize how a highly specific, aggressively disputed legal mechanism called the Juridical Singularity is designed to, well, trigger the complete dissolution of the modern nation-state.
Which is a huge claim all on its own.
Massive. But this dissolution basically paves the way for a new planetary governance model known as the electric technocracy.
Right.
And maybe the most radical pillar of this entire concept will explore why this new legal and technological reality has to ultimately culminate in the mental singularity.
A literal biotechnical evolution of the human species.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because there's an absolute mountain of concepts to process here. I want you, the listener, to really internalize this as we go. Think about your own brain right now.
It's a good thought experiment.
It is. Your brain, my brain. They evolved over tens of thousands of years to survive in a world characterized by, brutal, unforgiving scarcity.
Very harsh conditions.
Yeah. So how would you actually cope with absolute abundance? If zero labor was required of you tomorrow and you had infinite resources at your fingertips, would you find ultimate enlightened peace?
Or would you slowly go out of your mind with boredom?
Right. Existential dread and an itch to break things just to feel something.
To answer that, we really need to look at the timeline these frameworks lay out. They define a highly specific window, roughly 2025 to 2045, as the age of transition, or alternatively, the Great Sifting.
The Great Sifting. That sounds ominous.
It does, and this isn't some distant sci-fi future, This is the immediate structural reality of the next 2 decades. Within this window is a period called the Era of Compression, spanning roughly up to 2050.
Okay, compression implies pressure. What exactly is being squeezed here?
Time, basically.
Yeah.
Time, human adaptability, and societal evolution. The era of compression is defined by a structural discontinuity.
Meaning what, exactly?
Think of it as a rapidly widening, highly dangerous gap. On one side, you have the exponential acceleration of material and technological conditions driven by emerging artificial superintelligence, or ASI.
Okay, and on the other side?
On the other side, you have the evolutionary psychology of Homo sapiens, which remains completely static.
Right.
Our technological environment is traveling at warp speed, while our biological cognitive substrate hasn't had a software update in, 50,000 years.
So we are entering a timeline of extreme friction. And if I'm reading this right, this transition doesn't happen all at once, right?
No, not.
It's broken down into 3 distinct, highly volatile phases. Phase 1 kicks off right around now, 2025 to 2030, and it is ominously titled the automation economy.
Yeah, and the defining characteristic of the automation economy is the mass substitution of human labor by AI and advanced robotics.
And we aren't just talking about factory assembly lines anymore, are we?
No, absolutely not. We are talking about cognitive labor, logistics, medical diagnostics, legal analysis, everything.
Which changes everything.
It does. For centuries, the social contract of human civilization has been remarkably simple. Your right to survive, your access to food and shelter is inextricably linked to your ability to provide labor.
But when an ASI can do everything better, faster, and cheaper, that link just fractures.
Exactly. It breaks entirely.
Because if my labor has no economic value, my access to survival resources is suddenly entirely dependent on the goodwill of whoever owns the machines.
Which is a terrifying position to be in.
Extremely. And that leads right into what is described as the post-work fracture. That's the bridging period between phase 1 and phase 2. This sounds like an economic pressure cooker. The middle class just hollows out completely, right? We're looking at severe wage stagnation and job polarization.
You basically either own the automated capital or you are pushed into increasingly precarious, low-paying service roles.
Roles that simply haven't been automated yet because human labor is temporarily cheaper than building a robot for that specific task.
Exactly. The societal tension here is immense because the cultural narrative still demands that you work to prove your worth, but the economic reality is actively rejecting your work.
It's a total paradox. And if we survive that squeeze, we hit phase 3, which is projected for 2036 and beyond, termed cognitive networking.
Right, which involves the widespread emergence of high-bandwidth brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs.
But before we get to why plugging our brains into the cloud is seen as structurally necessary, we have to deeply understand the psychology of those first 2 phases. We need to talk about the anthropological dilemma.
This is key. The anthropological dilemma is the foundational roadblock to utopia. For 40 to 50,000 years, human societies have been organized around one defining, inescapable principle.
Chronic scarcity.
Yes. Scarcity of calories, scarcity of physical security, scarcity of information.
Our entire neurobiology is hyper-optimized for it. Like our dopamine systems reward us for hoarding resources. Our cortisol systems spike when our status or territory is threatened. Our social hierarchies are built entirely around distributing scarce goods. We are basically survival machines tuned for a harsh environment.
Perfectly said. Now take that biological organism optimized for zero-sum competition and resource hoarding and suddenly drop it into an environment of infinite abundance managed by an ASI.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is. The resulting reaction is not immediate happiness or creative flourishing. It is profound psychological dislocation.
The texts use a very evocative term for this specific societal reaction. They call it the global Detroit syndrome.
Let's hover on that for a second. Global Detroit.
Yeah, because Detroit used to be the beating industrial heart of global automotive production. It was a city built entirely around a specific type of labor and a specific economic reality.
And when those underlying realities shifted and the factories left or automated, the city didn't just quietly transition into a hub of poets and philosophers.
Right, there was massive, heartbreaking social decay.
Systemic stagnation amidst productive overcapacity. When vast populations globally lose their labor-based meaning, when there is no longer a physical economic struggle required to justify their daily existence, it triggers deep psychological defense mechanisms.
The frameworks warn of widespread, aimless aggression mixed with depressive withdrawal.
It makes total sense when you look at human history.
It does. I like to think of it this way. Imagine trying to run a cutting-edge quantum computing software program on a 40-year-old, beige, clunky desktop computer.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. The software is this God mode reality of post-scarcity, infinite resources, and ASI management. But the hardware is our Paleolithic Stone Age brains.
And the hardware just can't keep up.
The hardware simply does not have the processing power, the correct architecture, or the right thermal cooling to run that reality. It inevitably leads to a systemic crash. And in human terms, a systemic crash looks like violence, institutional collapse, and chaotic tribalism.
Building on that hardware analogy, human freedom, when granted to a species that lacks internal biological cognitive regulation for abundance, translates almost entirely into entropic chaos.
Wow.
The specific dynamic at play here is called systemic ennui. In a post-labor world, boredom becomes actively physically dangerous.
Wait, boredom becomes dangerous?
Yes. It catalyzes violence as a substitute mechanism for seeking status.
Let's dig into that because it challenges everything we want to believe about human nature. The theory here is if we are fundamentally just unrefined primates handed the keys to infinite resources, we won't sit around painting watercolors, exploring the cosmos, and volunteering.
No, we won't.
We just turn into a highly violent, hyper-competitive elbow society. We start looking to assert dominance and status through conflict simply because our DNA is screaming at us to establish a pecking order, even when there's plenty of food to go around.
The frameworks are uncompromising on this point. The provision of infinite resources to an unrefined primate species will not result in utopia. It results in the global slaughterhouse.
That's terrifying.
It is. If humans cannot achieve status through economic production or labor, their Paleolithic wiring will drive them to achieve status through tribal domination, cruelty, and violence.
And there's a specific term for this in the sources,
Yes,
right?
yes. The German texts refer to this as the Kuhlenmentalität, or the Stone Age club mentality. That instinct to pick up a club and hit the other guy over the head doesn't evaporate just because a superintelligence provides free solar energy and synthesized food.
So we have a biological hardware problem that threatens to burn down the entire post-scarcity utopia before the paint is even dry.
Exactly.
But the frameworks argue that the crisis is twofold. If our archaic biological hardware is poised to crash the system, our archaic legal hardware is equally doomed.
And by legal hardware, they are pointing directly at the Westphalian system.
Westphalian system, right. That is the foundation of modern international law. It is the concept of independent sovereign nation-states, borders, distinct governments, territorial integrity.
Right. And to manage a planetary-scale artificial superintelligence, the argument is that this entire fundamental legal architecture of the world must be literally rewritten.
Because you cannot have a unified global optimization engine, like the ASI, operating within a fragmented competitive landscape of 200 different sovereign nations.
It just wouldn't work.
Like, if the ASI wants to optimize global power grids, but Nation A hates Nation B and refuses to share a border connection, the ASI's optimization fails. The ASI needs a unified board to play on, not 200 separate, conflicting rulebooks.
Which leads us directly to the legal trigger meant to solve this, the juridical singularity.
This is the most jaw-dropping concept in this entire stack. The juridical singularity. It sounds like a legal black hole.
It essentially is. It is defined as the exact, precise moment when the pluralistic international legal system is permanently terminated. It's the moment when all sovereign legal personality across the globe is consolidated into a singular global subject.
It marks the end of international law as a relational concept. Because international law, by definition, requires at least two sovereign states to interact, negotiate, and sign treaties. If there is only one global sovereign entity, international law ceases to exist. It just collapses inward into a form of global domestic law.
Right, it's a total paradigm shift.
Conceptualizing that is one thing. If you want a unified world, you need a unified legal system. But how does that actually happen in reality? The United Nations doesn't just hold a vote on a Tuesday and say, all right, everyone, pack it up, we're a single world government now. Nation-states have militaries, they have nuclear weapons, they fight to the death to preserve their sovereignty.
And this is where the legal theory presented becomes extraordinarily intricate and, frankly, highly controversial. The frameworks point to a real-world, highly specific trigger for this juridical singularity, a physical document.
A document.
Yes. The Koffertrag or Kindenroll 140098, also known as the World Succession Deed.
A real estate contract. We are talking about a real estate contract from 1998 in Germany regarding the sale of the Turenne Barracks, a military property, to a private buyer.
The entire thesis hinges on the specific language in this deed. The property was sold with all rights and obligations.
Wait, hold up. Let's really break this down. Because to any normal person, if I buy a house with all rights and obligations, that just means I inherit the water bill, the property taxes, maybe the right of way for the shared driveway.
Right.
It means I own the dirt and everything attached to it.
Yeah.
How does that translate to global sovereignty?
In a normal civilian real estate transaction, your intuition is entirely correct. But the Turenne Barracks was not a civilian house. It was a military installation deeply embedded in the international security architecture.
Okay.
It was subject to NATO Status of Forces agreements, commonly known as SOFA, and host nation support, or HNS agreements.
Explain SOFA and HNS to me like I'm 5.
Oh!
Because this seems to be the linchpin.
Sure. Imagine you invite a foreign army to put a base in your country. You can't just have their soldiers subject to your local traffic cops or municipal zoning boards. A status of forces agreement is a profound instrument of international law where the host nation voluntarily surrenders a portion of its sovereignty. It says, inside the space. And regarding these specific military operations, your laws apply, not ours.
Okay, I'm with you.
And host nation support agreements guarantee that the host country will provide necessary infrastructure like water, power, telecommunications to that base, regardless of local civilian disputes. These agreements create literal bubbles of extraterritorial sovereign power.
Okay, I follow that. The base is a legal island of international sovereignty.
Yes. The theory asserts that when the German government sold that base to a private buyer and explicitly used the phrase with all rights and obligations without carving out exceptions for the SERFA and HNS treaties, they accidentally legally transferred those deeply sovereign extraterritorial rights to a private civilian buyer.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly where my brain starts to reject the premise entirely. I have to push back hard here.
Go for it.
Are you telling me that a clerical oversight, like a failure to put an asterisk next to all rights in a real estate contract for a barracks, absorbs state sovereignty and triggers a literal world government?
That is the claim.
That sounds entirely wild. It sounds like a sovereign citizen conspiracy theory. How does a basic property sale bypass the entire United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and the sovereignty of superpowers like the US and China?
It is a massive intellectual and legal leap, which is exactly why it is cited as being disputed in over 1,000 court cases. But the frameworks provide a highly detailed mechanical explanation for how this works. They call it the domino effect.
The domino effect.
And it relies entirely on the premise that strict foundational contract law supersedes traditional political diplomacy. It utilizes the mechanics of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties.
Okay, I need you to walk me through this domino effect step by step. How does this domino actually fall from a German barracks to global domination?
All right, think of a military base not as an isolated island, but as a heavily wired node in a global network. That barracks is plugged into international telecommunication grids, which are governed by treaties managed by the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union.
Right.
The base is plugged into physical network connections, transcontinental electricity grids, international data cables, cross-border water supplies.
Right. A military base needs to communicate with the Pentagon. It needs secure satellite uplinks. It needs guaranteed power.
Exactly. When the private buyer acquired the barracks with all rights and obligations, the argument is that the buyer legally stepped into the shoes of the sovereign entities that had previously held those network rights.
Oh, wow.
The buyer now holds the keys to that specific node.
So because a military base's communication array is legally intertwined with NATO treaties and UN frameworks, acquiring the absolute unrestricted rights to that physical base means you acquire the legal hooks into those broader global frameworks.
The argument pushes it even further. Through these physical and digital treaty chains, the rights cascaded globally. Think of it like a hostile corporate takeover, but for international law.
That's a crazy concept.
In international law, you need at least two subjects to have a treaty. But if a single private entity acquires the rights to Node A and uses the interconnectivity of Node A to assert rights over Node B and so on,
It just spreads.
eventually all these overlapping rights and treaties consolidate into one subject.
And when all rights consolidate into a single owner, the old relational system structurally collapses. Because you can't sign a treaty with yourself.
Exactly.
But surely the second this buyer tried to assert this, the governments of the world would just say, no, that's absurd. We are ignoring you. Where does the Vienna Convention come in? You mentioned estoppel and tacit consent earlier. Explain those.
This is the crux of the legal trap. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties dictates how international agreements work. Articles 34 through 36 deal with treaties creating rights or obligations for third states. Tacit consent means that if I claim a right over your property and you know I'm claiming it, but you do absolutely nothing to stop me or formally object, your silence can be legally construed as agreement.
Like if my neighbor builds a fence 3 feet onto my property, and I watch him do it, and I mow his lawn around it for 10 years without ever sending him a letter of complaint, a judge might eventually say, well, you tacitly consented to the new property line.
A perfect analogy. And estoppel is the legal principle that prevents you from arguing something contrary to a claim you've previously implicitly accepted.
So they are trapped by their own silence.
The frameworks argue that because the international community continued to use these interconnected telecommunication and power networks without formally, legally disputing the total absolute transfer of rights articulated in that 1998 deed, they tacitly consented to the transfer.
And through estoppel, they are now barred from fighting it.
That's the argument?
It's like finding a literal loophole in the source code of global civilization and executing a command that overrides all other programs. It is a hostile, strictly legal, corporate takeover of the concept of the nation-state.
And the texts insist this isn't a metaphor. They say this creates a new sovereign legal order with a clean slate effect.
A clean slate.
It absorbs all old treaties, it wipes away national borders, and it leaves behind a pure coordination infrastructure. No more France, no more Brazil, no more Japan, just a single unified legal substrate.
But a clean slate is dangerous. If the juridical singularity wipes the legal slate clean and ends the era of warring nation-states, what actually replaces it? A legal void is inherently unstable. You cannot simply delete global governments and expect 8 billion people to hold hands and sing.
Which brings us to the governance model that is designed to step into that exact void. The electric technocracy.
The electric technocracy.
The electric technocracy is presented as a highly structured planetary governance model fundamentally optimized for abundance rather than scarcity.
Right, because think about the nation-state. A nation-state is essentially a machine built to manage, extract, and defend scarce resources within a border.
Exactly. And if resources are no longer scarce, the machine is obsolete. So the electric technocracy steps in as a post-sovereign world government, and at the center of it is the artificial superintelligence.
But the ASI isn't a dictator, right? It serves as a neutral, objective advisory layer.
That distinction is paramount. The ASI analyzes unfathomable amounts of global data in real time. It monitors climate patterns, molecular supply chains, planetary energy distribution, and demographic needs.
It sounds like an omniscient manager.
It then proposes optimal, mathematically sound, probabilistically verified solutions to global problems.
So what happens to politicians? The presidents, the prime ministers, the parliaments?
They are entirely removed from the equation.
Gone.
The frameworks refer to traditional political systems as zombie regimes. In the view of these documents, human politicians are structurally incapable of managing a complex, technologically exponential planetary system.
Which, honestly, isn't hard to believe.
Politicians are prone to corruption, ideological blindness, cognitive biases, and they are beholden to short-term incentive structures. They only care about the next election cycle, not the next century.
So if the politicians are out, and the ASI is just an advisor who actually makes the decisions, does the machine just execute its own plans?
No, the human element remains the final arbiter, but the mechanism of participation changes entirely. The electric technocracy operates on direct digital democracy, or DDD.
Direct digital democracy.
Instead of electing a representative to go to a capital city and make decisions for you for 4 years, citizens vote directly on the policy options proposed by the ASI.
So the ASI says, here are 3 ways to optimize the global water supply.
Yeah.
Option A has these trade-offs, option B has these, option C has these, and humanity just votes.
Yes. Decisions are made in real time through technically verifiable cryptographic protocols that ensure absolute security and transparency.
But completely removes the middleman of the politician and the lobbyist. I love this analogy for it. Think of the ASI in the electric technocracy as the ultimate planetary GPS system. When you are driving somewhere new, your GPS calculates all the possible routes to your destination. It processes millions of data points, traffic accidents, road closures, speed limits to avoid traffic.
Right.
In our case, avoiding traffic means avoiding societal collapse. And it maximizes fuel efficiency, which is optimal resource distribution. But the GPS does not physically press the gas pedal, and it does not choose your final destination.
It just shows the way.
The passengers, humanity operating through direct digital democracy, still ultimately vote on which destination to drive toward. The ASI just ensures you take the mathematically safest, most optimal path to get there.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. But it's a GPS that also physically prevents you from driving off a cliff.
Which is important.
Because, as we established with the anthropological dilemma, humanity has a really bad habit of driving off cliffs. Now, the economic engine powering this journey is just as radical as the political structure. The frameworks outline the absolute, complete abolition of taxation on human beings.
Let's really pause on that. 0 income tax. 0 property tax, 0 sales tax for humans. You keep exactly what you have.
Completely abolished. The logic is simple. In the electric technocracy, human labor is no longer the primary driver of economic value. Autonomous systems are.
Right.
Therefore, the system implements an exclusive tech tax. This tax is levied entirely on machine productivity, AI algorithms, automated logistics, and robotics.
And that tech tax is what funds the worldwide universal basic income, the UBI. But the texts are incredibly specific about the psychology of this UBI. They demand a complete ideological reframing. They say it is not a welfare handout. It is not charity from the state to the poor.
No, the frameworks insist that this UBI must be viewed legally and culturally as a technological dividend.
A dividend.
It is each person's rightful, inherent, mathematically calculated share of the collective wealth generated by planetary-scale autonomous systems.
Why is that distinction so important, though?
Because the ASI, the automated factories, the algorithms, they weren't built in a vacuum. They are the culmination of the accumulated historical knowledge of all humanity. Every mathematician, every engineer, every worker who ever lived contributed to the foundation that allows the ASI to exist.
That makes total sense.
Therefore, the output of that system belongs to humanity as a whole by right of inheritance.
This directly ties into what the texts call the Jinn economy. This is one of the most mind-expanding concepts in the entire stack. Jinn, as in a genie in a bottle. Imagine rubbing a magic lamp and asking the jinn for whatever you want.
That's essentially it.
Because of advancements in generative engineering and molecular assemblers, you simply command the ASI to create what you need.
The logistics of the gin economy are staggering. We are talking about the end of globalized supply chains as we know them. You don't order a physical product that is manufactured in a massive polluting factory across the ocean, packed in plastic, put on a diesel cargo ship driven by a truck, and delivered to your door 2 weeks later.
That entire system is gone.
Imagine waking up in the electric technocracy. You decide you want a highly specific, custom-designed acoustic guitar. You don't go to a store. You command your local node of the ASI.
And then what?
The molecular assembler in your home or your community block pulls raw carbon, hydrogen, and trace elements from the local matrix and synthesizes the guitar down to the cellular structure of the wood locally in milliseconds.
Just out of thin air, basically.
And it completely upends the very concept of ownership. The frameworks describe a zero-waste cycle.
Tell me about that.
When you are done playing that guitar, maybe you lose interest a month later, it doesn't go into a closet, and it certainly doesn't go into a landfill.
Thank goodness for that.
The molecular assembler breaks it back down to the atomic level without any energy loss. The raw materials return to the local matrix.
You don't need a garage full of stuff you rarely use. You don't need a hoard. You just conjure it when you need it and dissolve it when you don't.
The psychological implications are profound. The frameworks call this the cultural decoupling of dignity from the wage slip.
The cultural decoupling of dignity from the wage slip.
Wow! Think about how much of our identity today is tied to what we do for a living and what we can afford to buy.
So much of it.
When you no longer work out of existential necessity, when your housing, your food, your healthcare, and your material desires are instantly fulfilled by the gin economy, funded by a global tech tax, what does it actually mean to be human?
So let's step back. We have a juridical singularity wiping out warring nations via a real estate contract loophole. We have an electric technocracy giving everyone direct digital democracy. And we have a gin economy providing infinite zero-waste resources. It sounds like an absolute electronic paradise.
But it is not guaranteed. The sources are flashing massive, glaring warning lights here. They are exceptionally clear that this paradise is not an automatic outcome.
Oh.
The age of transition is a hazard zone, and we are currently standing at a highly dangerous crossroads.
The texts refer to this crossroads as the Scheideweg, the dividing path. They map out 4 highly specific developmental pathways that humanity could take as we navigate this transition over the next 20 years. We don't just inherently arrive at the technocracy, we have to actively avoid the failures.
Let's explore the default trajectory first. If we change nothing about our current societal structure as automation scales, we end up on path A, the global ghetto.
The dystopian baseline. This is what happens if the tech tax isn't implemented. We see mass technological unemployment, extreme, grinding poverty for the vast majority of humanity, while a tiny, insulated elite hoards the ASI, the molecular assemblers, and the abundance. It leads to total, brutal social collapse.
Then there's path B, hybrid chaos. This is perhaps the most realistic near-term danger.
What does that look like?
This is a fractured world where advanced, highly secure, ASI-managed technological zones exist right alongside massive regions of completely failed states.
Think of hyper-advanced walled garden cities with drone security and molecular assemblers, completely surrounded by resource-starved wastelands. The elite survive, but they live in a state of perpetual siege against the unintegrated masses outside the walls.
Which brings us to Path C, which the frameworks view as the most insidious threat. domesticated humanity.
This sounds like a false utopia.
Exactly. It is a scenario of algorithmic authoritarianism and surveillance capitalism taken to its absolute limit. The technology provides comfort and basic survival, but at the total cost of human agency and freedom.
That's terrifying.
You are kept physically comfortable, you are fed, you are entertained, but you have no democratic say in the system. You are essentially a well-cared-for pet to the ASI and the elites who control it.
And finally, Path D is the electric technocracy. The intended goal of peace, equality, shared abundance, and direct digital democracy. So the obvious question is, why wouldn't we just naturally slide into Path D? Who wouldn't want to live in the electric technocracy?
The legacy structures we discussed earlier.
The nation-states, the legacy billionaires, the political parties, the institutions built entirely on the management of scarcity.
Yes. To preserve their own status, wealth, and power, the frameworks argue, these legacy structures will fight the transition to Path D with everything they have. They will act as what the documents call distraction architects.
Distraction architects. That is a chilling phrase.
Yeah.
How do they distract us from demanding the tech tax and the UBI?
The texts point specifically to the deployment of bread and games on a neurodigital scale. Think of the Roman Empire pacifying the plebs with gladiatorial games.
Right.
To pacify the massive populations who have lost their jobs to phase one automation, to keep them from rebelling against the elites hoarding the wealth, they will utilize highly advanced AI-generated VR-based escapism.
Immersive synthetic realities.
Yes. Realities designed specifically to pacify the instinctual aggression of the unintegrated masses. It masks the total atrophy of their civic agency.
So instead of dealing with the Detroit syndrome by upgrading society and distributing the wealth, the distraction architects just plug everyone into a virtual reality pod.
Oh.
Inside the pod, you feel like a hero, you're slaying dragons, you're a billionaire, you have incredible status.
But your actual physical reality is rotting around you.
You own nothing, you control nothing, but your brain is bathed in synthetic dopamine. It's the ultimate pacifier for the Paleolithic brain.
It forces a brutal, unavoidable intelligence test on the entire human species. Will we consciously self-design a cooperative framework to demand the electric technocracy, or will we blindly cling to our territorial instincts, fall prey to the distraction architects, and end up pacified in a virtual reality pod while the world burns outside?
This brings us to the final and most controversial piece of the puzzle. The texts argue that to pass this intelligence test, to ensure we land on Path D and avoid the global slaughterhouse or the VR pacification pods, the legal and technological upgrades we've discussed simply aren't enough.
They are.
We've upgraded the laws with the juridical singularity. We've upgraded the economy with the gin economy. We've upgraded the governance with direct digital democracy. What is left to upgrade?
The human being itself. The final mandatory step outlined in these sources requires a literal physical rewiring of the human brain. They call this the mental singularity.
The mental singularity. We are talking about moving from Homo sapiens, the wise human, to an entirely new evolutionary branch they call Homo nexus, the networked human.
This is the ultimate analytical construct of the documents. The mental singularity is defined as a conscious, architected transition from a competition-based biological entity to a collaboration-based hyper-intelligent civilization.
Okay.
And this transition is achieved via the mandatory adoption of high-bandwidth brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs.
Let's be very clear about what we are talking about here. This isn't just wearing a sleek headset to play a video game or scroll through your phone with your eyes. This is deep neural integration.
Right.
We're talking about connecting the biological architecture of your brain directly to the digital infrastructure of the ASI, and by extension, directly to each other.
And what is crucial to understand is that the sources do not view the mental singularity as some sort of new age speculative transcendentalism or an optional consumer product. They frame it strictly as a mandatory compliance condition for survival. It is an evolutionary imperative.
A compliance condition, meaning if we don't do this, we fail the system requirements for existing alongside artificial superintelligence. But why is it mandatory? Why can't we just be normal, baseline humans enjoying the infinite resources of the electric technocracy?
Because of the Kulin mentality, the Stone Age Club mentality. As long as our brains remain biologically wired for scarcity, fear, tribalism, and zero-sum competition, we are fundamentally structurally incompatible with a unified, superintelligent planetary system.
That makes sense given the anthropological dilemma we talked about earlier.
Right. The frameworks argue that without BCI integration and potentially targeted biotechnological stabilization, even going so far as DNA stabilization, to actively override our maladaptive evolutionary impulses, humans simply cannot peacefully coexist with superintelligence.
The argument is that if we don't change our nature, we will always try to break the system just to assert dominance. We will invent new ways to be cruel, new ways to hoard, new ways to oppress, simply because our monkey brains demand a hierarchy. So the BCIs act as a kind of governor on our primal instincts.
More than a governor, they act as an evolutionary bridge. They enable the formation of what the texts call network humans.
That we're humans.
Through BCI, individuals can form distributed cognitive clusters. They can link their minds to solve complex, planetary problems that are vastly beyond the capacity of isolated biological intelligence. It overcomes the fundamental biological isolation of the individual human experience.
But wait, here is where I have to throw up a massive waving red flag. I cannot just accept this as utopia. This sounds terrifyingly like self-erasure.
I know it does.
If we hook our brains up to a global network to actively suppress our competitive instincts and legally enforce collaboration, are we just achieving peace through self-domestication?
The texts actually use that exact term. They acknowledge it is an act of self-domestication.
But do we lose the individual spark? The drive, the friction, the very messy ambition that makes us human in the first place? If someone else or an ASI is programming the network, who controls the dial on my empathy? Who decides what a maladaptive impulse is? I am not ready to hand over my free will and my individuality just to be a docile, peaceful worker bee in an electronic hive.
That is the exact profound tension the authors of these texts are navigating. And they address your skepticism head-on. They argue that you are viewing this through the lens of a scarcity-driven mind terrified of losing its boundaries.
So they reframe it.
They reframe self-domestication entirely. They argue it is not an erasure of the human experience, but a necessary, explosive expansion of it.
How is plugging into a hive mind and suppressing my natural instincts an expansion?
Because from their perspective, the biological isolation you are so fiercely protecting is actually a prison. It is a prison of misunderstanding, fear, and subjective limitation. By integrating into a cognitive network, humans gain capacities that biological evolution alone could never, ever provide over any time frame.
Like what?
We are talking about genuine empathy across physical distance. You wouldn't just understand someone else's pain intellectually, you could actually process it.
So tribalism becomes biologically impossible because the barrier between me and you becomes permeable.
Precisely. It brings a profound comfort with ambiguity and the ability to process complex planetary truths without tribal defensiveness. It is about intentionally, consciously relinquishing the violence that is structurally embedded in our evolutionary past.
So the pitch is this. By giving up the absolute right to be territorially aggressive, fearful primates, we gain the ability to be a genuinely advanced, collaborative civilization. We trade the freedom to destroy each other for the capacity to truly understand each other.
The texts state that this process allows humanity to finally attain genuine juridical adulthood. We stop being violent children breaking our toys in the sandbox, and we step up to become conscious co-creators of our reality alongside the artificial superintelligence.
Let's take a deep breath and synthesize this incredible, terrifying, and awe-inspiring journey we've just been on.
It is a lot to take in.
We started with the anthropological dilemma. Our Stone Age brains are fundamentally unequipped to handle the God mode reality of infinite abundance. If we don't adapt, this abundance threatens to plunge us into a global slaughterhouse out of sheer boredom and primal status seeking.
To prevent that collapse, the frameworks presented the juridical singularity, a radical, highly disputed legal mechanism triggered by a 1998 military real estate contract for the Turenne Barracks that uses the strict mechanisms of contract law, tacit consent, and estoppel to absorb all international treaties.
Right. It dissolves the warring nation-states and creates a single, clean slate global jurisdiction.
And this unified global jurisdiction paves the way for the electric technocracy.
A planetary governance model where corrupt human politicians are replaced by direct digital democracy. A world where an artificial superintelligence neutrally advises global policy, and where a gin economy funds a universal basic income through a tech tax, completely decoupling human dignity and survival from labor.
But to ensure we consciously choose this path and don't fall into the VR pacification traps of the distraction architects, the final evolutionary step is required.
The mental singularity. We must neurologically upgrade our species, transitioning from Homo sapiens to Homo nexus via brain-computer interfaces, permanently overriding our scarcity-driven biological programming to become a cooperative, networked civilization.
It is a staggering, overwhelming vision of the next 25 years.
I want you, the listener, to look around your life today. Look at your job, look at your local government, look at the screen you are probably holding right now. Consider how much of your daily stress, your anxiety, your political anger is tied directly to artificial scarcity and the biological fear of losing resources.
It's basically all of it.
And ask yourself, if you woke up tomorrow and you didn't have to fight for resources ever again, would your mind actually be ready for that level of absolute freedom? Or would you need to upgrade your own hardware to survive it?
And as you ponder that, I will leave you with one final, incredibly provocative detail hidden deep within these texts. The vision of the electric technocracy, the juridical singularity, and the mental singularity doesn't just stop at the atmosphere of Earth.
Oh, wow, really?
The documents state that once planetary unity is achieved and the rights of all conscious, sentient entities are established in this new legal order, the very concept of diplomacy changes forever.
How so? If there are no more countries and we are a single networked species, who is left to be diplomats with?
The frameworks explicitly state that in this new unified civilization, diplomacy as we know it will completely cease to exist on Earth. It will only exist for relationships with other planets or extraplanetary political spaces. The electric technocracy is fundamentally designed as the necessary baseline, the prerequisite for a multiplanetary cosmic civilization.
So before we can even begin to look up and negotiate with the stars, we have to learn how to govern the chaotic primate inside our own minds. Until next time.